Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Inca Sling. In the spring of 1536, a Spanish cavalry unit under Hernando Pizarro attempted to breach a ridge above the city of Cusco. The Inca defenders did not use bows. They did not use crossbows. What stopped the Spanish, seasoned soldiers armed with Toledo steel and firearms, was a group of men standing on a hillside holding leather straps. The Andean sling, called the huaraca in Quechua, was not a primitive weapon. It was a precision instrument with a ballistic profile that modern physics confirms. Spanish chronicler Pedro de Cieza de Leon documented the weapon in the 1550s, noting that slingers could hurl stones hard enough to split a sword. His account was dismissed for centuries as exaggeration. In 2019, a forensic analysis published in the International Journal of Osteoarchaeology examined skeletal remains from Inca period conflict sites in Peru. What the researchers found was consistent with modern high-velocity trauma: skull fractures with inward beveling patterns, exit wound morphology, the kind of damage you see from high-speed projectile trauma and ballistic forensics today. The projectiles were not simply rounded river rocks. Archaeological recovery from Inca military sites shows aerodynamically shaped clay projectiles, bolitas, formed in specific teardrop geometries. The shapes create gyroscopic stabilization during flight. The principle is identical to the rifling on a modern firearm barrel. Modern ballistic testing of period-accurate Andean slings achieved muzzle velocities of 250 to 270 miles per hour. A .44 Magnum handgun fires at approximately 1,500 feet per second, around 1,000 miles per hour. But the Inca sling's energy transfer was concentrated in a stone projectile with 4 to 8 times the mass of a modern handgun bullet. The kinetic energy on impact was not trivial. Here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The Spanish military had extensive experience with slings from their own medieval tradition. They recorded the Andean sling as superior to anything they had previously encountered, not in velocity, but in accuracy in stopping power at distances exceeding 200 meters. That level of accuracy at 200 meters requires a ballistic consistency that modern engineers, studying the recovered bolitas, attribute to manufacturing precision they cannot match with available hand-forming techniques. The huaraca remains in use in the Andes today. Modern sling athletes attempting to match Inca records consistently find the ancient designs outperform modern materials. The Spanish eventually adapted by mounting forward cavalry scouts with protective padding around their horses' necks. The Inca slinger had forced the most advanced military in the world to modify their tactics. Not by matching Spanish technology, by perfecting something the Spanish had abandoned centuries earlier. Number 9. The Scorpion Bombs of Hatra. In 198 AD, the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus led the largest military force Rome had assembled since the campaigns of Trajan against a single walled city in present-day northern Iraq. He had 80,000 men. He had siege engines. He had Rome's best military engineers. He failed. The city was Hatra, a trading center of the Parthian Empire that had already repelled Roman forces under Trajan in 116 AD. The second siege lasted weeks. Severus withdrew. His biographers in the Historia Augusta recorded that the defenders had used not just conventional weapons, but pots filled with flying things. In 2009, classicist Adrian Mayer at Stanford University published research in the Journal of the History of Biology, examining those flying things in the context of the broader ancient record of entomological and chemical warfare. What she identified in the Hatra case was the first documented use of biological projectile weapons in recorded military history. The vessel contents, corroborated by archaeological excavations at Hatra in the 1990s by an Iraqi archaeological team, included Androctonus crassicauda, the Arabian fat-tailed scorpion. It remains one of the most venomous animals on Earth. Its venom attacks the sodium channels and nerve cells, causing convulsive death within 2 to 4 hours without antivenom. There was no antivenom available in 198 AD. The clay pots used had walls calibrated to a specific thickness, thin enough to shatter on impact against armor or stone, releasing their contents into confined spaces like siege equipment and tunnel entrances, but thick enough to survive the throw without breaking prematurely. The engineering of the delivery mechanism was not incidental. Here's where the standard explanation becomes genuinely disturbing. Mayer's research identified Hatra as a case study within a broader pattern. Hannibal Barca, in 184 BC, is documented in Cornelius Nepos' Lives of Eminent Commanders as having ordered clay vessels filled with venomous serpents hurled onto the decks of Pergamon ships during a naval battle near Eurymedon. The battle was won. The question isn't whether ancient armies used living creatures as weapons. The question is what they understood about entomology, toxicology, and delivery mechanisms that allowed them to weaponize biological agents with sufficient reliability to deploy them in an active siege. Androctonus crassicauda does not travel well. Keeping hundreds of viable, venomous scorpions alive in sealed ceramic vessels, in desert heat, and delivering them to a precise target zone requires a level of operational planning that modern military analysts categorize as biological weapons logistics. Hatra fell eventually, not to Rome, but to the Sassanid Persians in 241 AD. The scorpion delivery system was never successfully replicated by any other military force in recorded history. Number 8. The Ulfbert Swords. In 2006, materials scientist Alan Williams at the Wallace Collection in London completed a metallurgical analysis of 44 Viking Age swords bearing the inscription plus VLFBERHT+. The swords date from approximately 800 to 1000 AD. They were found across Scandinavia, Germany, and the British Isles. Williams found something that contradicted the established timeline of European metallurgy by approximately 800 years. The Ulfbert blades contained carbon levels of 1.0 to 1.3%, placing them in the category of crucible steel. The slag inclusion levels were effectively zero. For comparison, the best European swords of the same era typically contained 0.7 to 0.8% carbon and were laden with slag inclusions that created internal stress fractures. The metallurgical gap between a standard Viking sword and an Ulfbert was not incremental. It was categorical. Crucible steel requires smelting temperatures above 1,600 degrees Celsius, temperatures that European bloomery furnaces of the 9th century could not achieve. The technology to produce zero-slag crucible steel did not develop in Europe until the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. What was being produced in medieval Scandinavia was functionally identical to what 19th century Sheffield steelmakers would eventually call high-carbon crucible steel. Approximately 170 Ulfbert swords have been identified in museum collections worldwide. A significant number of them are demonstrably inferior copies, pattern-welded blades with the name stamped on them, suggesting a market of forgeries targeting buyers who knew the Ulfbert name meant superior metallurgy. The existence of systematic forgeries implies an acknowledged and recognized quality standard. Here's where the implication deepens. The chemical signature of the steel and authenticated Ulfbert blades corresponds to Wootz ore, sources in modern Afghanistan and the Caucasus region, the same geographic zone that supplied the Silk Road trade networks. Williams's analysis suggests the steel was produced in Central Asia, using techniques not available in Europe and traded through Volga-Viking river networks into Scandinavia. What makes this particularly unsettling is what the Ulfbert trail implies about everything it didn't preserve. If a technological import this significant was moving through 9th century trade networks and has left only 170 physical traces, how much other advanced material knowledge traveled along the same routes and left nothing? The last authenticated Ulfbert sword dates to approximately 1000 AD. Then the trail ends. Whatever supply chain produced or imported the ore collapsed. The technology vanished from the archaeological record. No workshop has ever been identified, no forge, no record of the craftsman. Only the blades in museum cases, and the fakes made by people who knew what the real thing was worth. Number 7. The Aztec Macuahuitl. In 1520, a Spanish soldier named Bernal Diaz del Castillo witnessed something that he recorded in his memoir, The True History of the Conquest of New Spain, with the clinical specificity of a man who had seen many things and was not given to exaggeration. He watched an Aztec warrior decapitate a horse with a single stroke. The weapon was the Macuahuitl, a wooden sword approximately 3 feet long, edged with blades of volcanic obsidian set in parallel rows into grooves along both sides. The obsidian edges, Diaz noted, were sharper than Spanish Toledo steel. He was correct. The magnitude of that observation is only understood with modern materials science. Obsidian fractures along a conchoidal plane and breaks in a curve that traces the crystalline structure of the volcanic glass. A properly knapped obsidian blade achieves an edge of approximately 30 angstroms, 3 nanometers. Human hair is 70,000 nanometers in diameter. A modern surgical scalpel achieves an edge of approximately 250 to 500 angstroms. The obsidian blade is 10 to 16 times sharper. Modern surgeons conducting eye surgery have used obsidian scalpels in cases requiring subcellular precision. The tissue damage from an obsidian cut is measurably less than from steel because the edge is thin enough to pass between cells rather than through them. No authentic Macuahuitl survives. Here's where the standard explanation becomes genuinely disturbing. The Aztec Imperial Collection, approximately 300 Macuahuitl weapons, was housed in the Museo Nacional de Ciencias Naturales in Madrid. In 1884, the museum burned. Every specimen was destroyed. What we know about the macua huaytl comes entirely from Spanish written accounts and 3 surviving drawings. The manufacturing technique, how the obsidian blades were fitted into the hardwood grooves with the adhesive compound that held them without cracking during combat impact, was never documented by the Spanish administrators who collected and cataloged those weapons. The result is that we have extensive physical evidence of the material properties of obsidian, extensive eyewitness accounts of the weapon's battlefield effectiveness, and absolutely no physical specimen to study. The most precisely engineered blade weapon in the pre-Columbian Americas was erased, not by time, by decision. The adhesive compound that bonded obsidian to hardwood under the forces of combat is a particular loss. Spanish accounts describe blades that remained fixed through multiple engagements. No modern adhesive tested against obsidian to hardwood bonding under impact conditions has fully replicated the retention described. The formula, like the weapons themselves, is gone. Number 6. The Claw of Archimedes. In the summer of 214 BC, a Roman fleet of 60 warships commanded by the consul Marcus Claudius Marcellus arrived at the harbor of Syracuse, on the eastern coast of Sicily. The Senate expected a swift capture. What followed became one of the most documented mechanical defeats in Roman history. Polybius, writing within 40 years of the events, describes what happened when the Roman ships reached the walls of Syracuse. A machine, the Machine of Archimedes, extended iron claws over the harbor wall, seized Roman ships by their prows, lifted them out of the water, and dropped them. Plutarch, writing 3 centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, describes Roman soldiers fleeing at the appearance of anything mechanical, extending over the walls, convinced the city was defended by supernatural machines. Marcellus eventually called off the naval assault and settled for a land siege that lasted 3 years. In 2005, a team assembled by the Discovery Channel constructed a period-accurate version of the claw, using materials and engineering methods available to 3rd century BC Greek craftsmen. Bronze pulleys, hemp rope, and lever mechanisms documented in Archimedes' own surviving mechanical texts. The reconstruction successfully lifted a 1-ton load. Here's where the engineering becomes genuinely disturbing. A standard Roman quinquereme, the primary warship class at the siege of Syracuse, displaced approximately 120 tons, fully loaded with its crew of 300 men. Lifting 120 tons with a leverage system requires a counterweight and mechanical advantage configuration that, when calculated backward from the described effect, implies an understanding of compound pulley systems that was not formally re-derived in Europe until the Renaissance. Archimedes is known to have written On the Equilibrium of Planes. It survives. On Floating Bodies. It survives. His treatise on mechanical devices was lost in the sack of Constantinople in 1453. What other machines are described in those pages remains unknown. The implication is not simply that Archimedes was brilliant. The implication is that a single individual's death. He was killed by a Roman soldier in his home in 212 BC while working at a diagram in the sand, the soldier not knowing who he was until afterward, removed from the historical record a body of mechanical knowledge whose full extent we cannot recover. The claw worked. We know it worked because Rome lost ships. What else worked and was never tested again after Syracuse fell, we cannot say. Number 5. The Burning Mirrors of Archimedes. The claw was not the only weapon deployed at Syracuse. The other device, described in sources including Galen, Anthemius of Tralles, and the Arab polymath Al-Kind, was an array of mirrors that focused sunlight onto Roman ships until they caught fire. The concept was dismissed for most of modern history as a later mythological embellishment. Then, in 1747, the French naturalist Georges-Louis Leclerc conducted an experiment using 168 flat mirror segments mounted on a single frame. He ignited a wooden plank at a distance of 150 feet. In 2005, students at MIT, under the supervision of engineering faculty, constructed a period-accurate array of 127 flat-polished bronze mirrors, each approximately 1 square foot. Targeting a wooden ship replica 100 feet away, in conditions approximating the Mediterranean summer sun angle at Syracuse, they achieved ignition within 10 minutes. The technology works. The physics is not in dispute. Here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The MIT experiment required coordinated movement of 127 mirrors, tracking a stationary target under controlled conditions. A Roman warship in harbor combat is moving. Swell introduces constant position variation. Focusing 127 independently held mirrors on a moving target at 100 feet for 10 minutes requires a level of real-time coordination that is, under honest analysis, implausible with unaided human operators following verbal commands. What this implies, and what no academic paper has directly stated, is that either the burning mirror accounts are exaggerated, or there was a mechanical coordination system that allowed the mirror array to track a moving target while maintaining focal concentration. A linked frame. Something that moved the mirrors together. Archimedes had built mechanical models of the solar system accurate enough to track celestial movement. He had the theoretical framework for the Antikythera mechanism's predecessors. The mechanical sophistication required to build a linked mirror tracking array was within his documented capability. Whatever he built was not preserved. Syracuse fell in 212 BC. His workshop did not survive the sack. What Marcellus lost 3 years trying to defeat through a harbor full of lost ships, a soldier ended in a house with a geometric diagram and a man who didn't look up in time. Number 4, the formula of Greek fire. On the night of September 3, 672 AD, a Byzantine naval squadron commanded by Callinicus of Heliopolis deployed a weapon for the first time against an Arab fleet in the Sea of Marmara. What happened next was documented by 4 independent Byzantine chroniclers, an Arab historian, and a Syriac Christian monk who witnessed it from shore. The Arab fleet caught fire on the surface of the sea, and burned, and continued burning. The weapon became known as Greek fire, liquid fire, sea fire, prepared fire, and for the next 300 years, it was the primary strategic deterrent of the Byzantine Empire. The formula was held by one family, the family of Callinicus. Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, writing in the 10th century, explicitly instructed his son that the formula must never be revealed to foreign powers, describing it as divinely given to the Byzantine state. The formula died in 1204 AD when Crusaders sacked Constantinople. Modern chemical analysis of the surviving historical descriptions has produced dozens of proposed formulas. Quicklime and seawater, naphtha and calcium phosphide, pine resin and sulfur, potassium nitrate and petroleum distillate. None of them fully replicates what the historical record describes. Here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The property that no modern formula has replicated is duration. Greek fire in battle accounts burns for extended periods, multiple minutes to hours, on open water. Every modern analog ignites, burns briefly, and extinguishes. Period accounts describe Greek fire continuing to burn after being covered with water, sand, and vinegar. The Byzantine era recommended countermeasure. Sand and vinegar do not extinguish anything truly burning from a petroleum or resin base. They smother and dilute. Greek fire, per the accounts, was unaffected. The most credible modern theory, proposed by John Halden and Morris Byrne in the journal Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies, involves quicklime mixed with petroleum creating a self-igniting compound that floats and generates heat sufficient to sustain combustion. But the exact proportions, the stabilization additives that prevented premature ignition during storage and transport aboard ships, and the pressurized bronze siphon pump delivery mechanism remain unverified in any modern reconstruction. 300 years of battlefield deployment, a formula that defeated the Arab Caliphate at its peak expansion. The formula held by one family for 532 years. And we cannot produce it from everything that was written down. Number 3, Damascus steel. In November 2006, materials scientists Peter Poffler and Marianne Reibold at the University of Dresden published findings in the journal Nature. Their subject was a Damascus steel sword blade dated to approximately 1700 AD. One of the last authentic specimens before production of the formula disappeared from the historical record. Under transmission electron microscopy, inside the steel, they found carbon nanotubes. A carbon nanotube is a cylindrical structure of carbon atoms approximately 1 nanometer in diameter. The properties of carbon nanotubes, exceptional tensile strength, electrical conductivity, thermal characteristics, were first identified by Sumio Iijima in 1991. They are currently synthesized in laboratories for aerospace applications and medical devices. In 2006, they were found inside a sword blade, made by craftsmen working without electron microscopes, without atomic theory, and without any scientific framework that would allow intentional nanostructure engineering. The implication is not that medieval Syrian metalworkers knew they were creating carbon nanotubes. The implication is that whatever process they were using, whatever exact combination of ore chemistry, temperature profile, and technique, accidentally produced nanostructures of sufficient sophistication that modern materials science cannot reliably replicate them through conventional means. Authentic Damascus Wootz steel is distinguished by a surface pattern of flowing bands. Modern Damascus knives are produced by folding and etching two types of steel. This is pattern welding. It produces a similar surface appearance. It is not Wootz. The internal crystalline structure is completely different. The cutting performance is not comparable. The carbon nanotube content is not present. Here's where the mystery deepens. The last authenticated Wootz production in South Asia and the Middle East dates to approximately 1750. Then the formula simply stops. No documented transmission, no final apprentice, no record of the last forge's closure. The best theory, proposed by John Verhoeven at Iowa State University, is that the specific ore used, possibly from the Golconda mines of India, contained trace amounts of vanadium, chromium, and molybdenum in precise concentrations. These elements acted as catalysts in the steel's carbon chemistry, creating the conditions for nanotube formation at pre-industrial smelting temperatures. When those mines were exhausted or abandoned, the exact ore chemistry ceased to exist. Without that specific chemistry, the same process produced ordinary high-carbon steel. Not Wootz. If correct, the formula was not forgotten. The raw material was lost. The specific ground that happened to produce carbon nanotubes under a pre-industrial smelting process disappeared from the supply chain, and with it, a material property that modern manufacturing has spent 30 years trying to engineer deliberately. The weapon that made Arabic poetry reference its impossible cutting edge, that equipped the warrior traditions of 3 continents, is gone. Not because anyone forgot, because the earth changed. Number 2, the vitrified forts of Scotland. Between approximately 700 BC and 400 AD, cultures across the highlands of Scotland, parts of France, Sweden, and Germany built hillforts. The construction was conventional for the Iron Age, timber-laced stone walls enclosing hilltops, some spanning hundreds of meters in perimeter. Then something happened to more than 60 of them. The stone walls were melted, not damaged, not burned, melted. The stone rubble of the walls had fused into a glassy, solid mass, vitrification, that requires sustained temperatures of 1000 to 1100 degrees Celsius. The phenomenon was first documented by John Williams in 1777 in his Natural History of the Mineral Kingdom. He examined the forts, sampled the vitrified material, and concluded that the temperatures involved exceeded anything a simple wood fire could produce. Williams proposed a volcanic explanation. There are no volcanoes in Scotland. The standard explanation today: defenders deliberately lit fires against the walls to strengthen them. The vitrification was intentional fortification engineering. Here's where the standard explanation falls apart completely. A wood fire burning at the base of a stone wall reaches temperatures of approximately 600 degrees Celsius under optimal conditions. Sustained heat in an enclosed stone structure might approach 700 degrees. Vitrification of the stone and timber composites found in these forts requires temperatures 400 degrees higher than wood fires can achieve without bellows, supplemental fuel, and industrial-scale furnace design. Experiments conducted by Ian Ralston at the University of Edinburgh in the 1990s attempted to replicate the vitrification using period-accurate construction methods and fuel. Ralston's team found they could not produce vitrification comparable to what exists in the authentic forts without introducing modern accelerants. Control experiments using period materials produced partial melting, not the uniform glass-like fusion found at sites like Tapo Noth in Aberdeenshire, where vitrification extends across a 90-meter wall section, with consistency that implies a uniform and sustained heat source. What makes this particularly disturbing is the pattern of where the vitrification occurs. In Scottish hill forts, the glass-like fusion is not found predominantly on the interior wall surfaces and where a defensive fire would be built. It is found predominantly on the exterior faces, the surfaces facing the direction of approach by an attacker. The weapon that vitrified those walls was applied from outside, by an attacking force that possessed something capable of sustaining temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius, directed at stone construction from the exterior, at multiple sites separated by hundreds of kilometers across 2,000 years. The Iron Age technology inventory does not contain that weapon. No mainstream archaeological paper has proposed a satisfying identification of what it was. The forts remain in the Scottish Highlands, the glass remains in the stone, and the weapon that created it has never been named. Number 1. The devastation of Mohenjo-Daro. In 1922, a team of archaeologists led by R.D. Banerjee excavated a site in the Indus Valley in what is now Pakistan. What they found became known as Mohenjo-Daro, Mound of the Dead, one of the most sophisticated urban centers of the ancient world. Planned street grids, advanced sewage systems with brick-lined drains, standardized brick dimensions across a civilization spanning 650,000 square miles. A culture that had achieved urban planning that would not be equaled in the region for 2,000 years, and then it stopped. Around 1900 BC, the collapse of Mohenjo-Daro has multiple competing explanations: climate change, flooding, epidemic, invasion by Indo-Aryan peoples. But the physical evidence at the site contains an anomaly that none of these explanations address. In 1979, researchers David Davenport and Ettore Vincenti published an analysis, cited in the journal Il Bollettino del Museo Civico di Storia Naturale di Verona, of material collected from excavation layers associated with the site's destruction horizon. They identified what they called black stones, fused lumps of pottery and building material found clustered in specific areas of the site. The composition of the fused material indicated exposure to temperatures of approximately 1,500 degrees Celsius for a duration sufficient to produce uniform vitrification. In 1996, the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts in New Delhi examined skeletal remains recovered from Mohenjo-Daro's streets. The positioning of the bodies, found in groups, in the street, not in shelters, was inconsistent with epidemic death, which typically produces bodies in beds and homes. The skeletal analysis found no evidence of weapon trauma from conventional weapons, no sword cuts, no arrow points, no blunt force fractures. The people stopped moving in the street. No wound explains why. Here's where the standard explanation has never recovered. The Indus Valley script, the written language of the people who built Mohenjo-Daro, has never been decoded. Whatever the inhabitants recorded about what happened to them is inaccessible. We have the physical evidence they left behind: streets, bodies, and fused stone. We have no testimony. The 1,500-degree vitrification documented at Mohenjo-Daro matches the temperature profile required to produce the glass-like fusion found in the Scottish hillforts. It matches the upper range of what would be required to produce similar patterns documented in geological surveys of ancient sites across the Thar Desert in Rajasthan, where ground surface melting without crater formation has been confirmed by independent researchers, a pattern that rules out simple impact events. 3 separate ancient contexts across 3 separate geographic zones, across a span of more than 1,000 years: Scotland, the Indus Valley, the Thar Desert, show physical evidence of exposure to sustained temperatures that no conventional Bronze Age or Iron Age weapon can produce. The Scottish fort's exterior wall surfaces vitrified from the attacking direction. Mohenjo-Daro, interior pavement zones fused at street level. The Rajasthan sites, ground surface melting without subsurface crater signatures. The question that mainstream archaeology has declined to answer directly is what connects them. Whether the answer is geological, astronomical, technological, or something that sits outside current categories, it implies a thermal event capable of directed, sustained, and locally concentrated heat delivery at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The civilization at Mohenjo-Daro built the world's first known urban sewage system. They measured weight with standardized bronze balances accurate to 0.1 grams. Their urban planning produced city blocks with a precision that rivals modern surveying. Whatever destroyed them left no tool, no weapon, no confession, and no explanation that the current inventory of ancient weapons can satisfy. Only glass in the streets, and bodies that stopped walking, and a written language that has not spoken since. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.